This is number one Broadway. Depending on the direction you're walking, it's either the first building you see on Broadway or it's the last building you see on Broadway. To the south is Battery Park, which many of you have probably visited. Of course, if you live in New York, you know Battery Park. Many of you, if you have visited and taken the ferry out to the Statue of Liberty, you got that ferry at Battery Park, and you might have visited Castle Clinton in the park as well. So Battery Park to the south. To the southeast is the U.S. Customs House, Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. And by the way, I have a two-part video here on YouTube about the U.S. Customs House. Part one about the exterior architecture and part two about the interior architecture. And I will link to those at the end of this video so that you can see them and learn about that magnificent Beaux-Arts building across the street. Directly across the street from One Broadway to the east, we find the Bowling Green Park, which has been there since before the Revolutionary War, always called the Bowling Green. Some of you might know that is where the statue of King George stood that was torn down in July of 1776. So it's the Bowling Green. Today at One Broadway stands a beautiful office building that was originally built by the International Mercantile Marine Company. IMM was a steamship company. They carried passengers and cargo, and they built a beautiful Queen Anne style building here when they opened their company. And this is a postcard look at that beautiful building as it opened. Now that building is still here, but it's covered by limestone. By the 1920s, it became popular to cover the facades of the buildings on Lower Broadway with limestone. So today we see that building with the limestone covering or casing on the outside. Across the street on the other side of Broadway, another famous building that has this limestone covering is the old Standard Oil building, which was a brick building initially as well. So back to International Mercantile Marine. When the building opened, or when the company opened, the Hudson River was directly behind it. So if you are walking behind this building and you see that whole new development called Battery Park City, landfill, that was not there when this building was built. So you would enter this building, check in, go out through the back and board your ship, which was docked right behind the building on Greenwich Street. And that's still Greenwich Street today, the original shore. If you walk along the south side of the building, the side facing Battery Park, you can still see over the entrances the markings for passenger class and first class. So you have the two different class entrances on the south side of the building still there. If we back up and we look at the facade and we look at the second level, we see a whole series of beautiful crests. Each one of those crests represents a port of call for IMM. So all around the building are these beautiful crests representing all of the places from which they travel back and forth. So very nice, beautiful limestone building, and also just an incredible archway entrance with all sorts of sculpture representing travel and trade and the ocean. Very beautiful buildings still today. Prior to IMM being on the site, there was a series of other things. There was a hotel, there was a bank, a whole bunch of things in the 1800s. But what most people know this address, number one Broadway, for is that it was the headquarters of General George Washington during the Revolutionary War in 1776. If you took any of my walking tours, that's what you know it as. Lots of other reasons you might know that. And that's really what we're going to talk about. The year 1776 and the history of this building, or I should say the history of this site that year. If you've seen my videos about the Battle for New York that I've been putting out, then you know that in 1776, the Battle for New York was coming. The British had arrived. They are out on Staten Island. So Staten Island is one of what we call the 5 boroughs of New York City, and it's a massive island out there in New York Harbor. If you visited and you took the Staten Island ferry out there as a tourist, then you've been on that big kind of taxi yellow ferry that takes you out there. If you live in Staten Island, you definitely know what Staten Island is. And of course, people in the New York, New Jersey area know as well. So we have Staten Island out there in the harbor, the British headquarters in 1776. Manhattan Island is the American headquarters in 1776. And Washington won't arrive in One Broadway until a bit later in the year. In the spring, in residence at One Broadway was the then commander of forces on Manhattan Island, General Israel Putnam. And that summer, Israel Putnam opened his home to a teenage girl to come and stay with him and his wife and daughters. She stayed for a few months and then returned back to her family. Nobody thought anything about it for 17 years. And then 17 years later, that young woman, now an adult woman, wrote a memoir. And that memoir just blew the top off of an incredible scandal that may or may not have happened in 1776. It involved a 14-year-old girl, Margaret Moncrieffe, of course, Israel Putnam and his family, and also Israel Putnam's aide that summer, Major Aaron Burr, who, when the memoir was published, was now Senator Aaron Burr. So this is the story of Margaret Moncrieffe and Aaron Burr, which may or may not have really occurred. Now, I know some people are probably saying, oh, Mrs. Q, why are you wasting all of our time on this story that most people don't even believe? The reason I'm going to talk about it is to illustrate a couple things. One is that it is almost impossible to know with certainty what things really occurred in the past unless we have many different original source documents to tell us. In the case of Miss Moncrieffe, we only have her memoir written 17 years later, which could be used by supporters of Burr to prove one thing and enemies of Burr to prove another thing about his personality and his life. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about the life of Miss Moncrieffe, because it really is a pretty incredible story about the decadence of the British aristocracy. So you ready for the story? It's really great. Let's get started. So as I mentioned, spring 1776, the British are moving in on New York. They are out on Staten Island. The Americans are on command on Manhattan Island. And a young girl named Margaret Moncrieffe, she may be 13, 14, or 15 years old, depending on whose story you like. So I'll just say she's 14 years old. I'll take the middle age there. 14-year-old Miss Margaret Moncrieffe writes a letter to General Israel Putnam. Moncrieffe is the daughter of British Major Thomas Moncrieffe. Major Moncrieffe and General Putnam are old friends, having served in the French and Indian War together, and like many American-based officers, Major Moncrieffe has lived a large part of his life in America. This is an important thing to know to be able to understand this story, is that British officers, some of them were based here for 10, 12, 15 years or more. So of course they were well integrated into American society and even had American wives. For instance, let me think of somebody, General Thomas Gage, who was in command in New York for a dozen years and is known for Lexington and Concord, being the general there. His wife was from New Jersey. Miss Moncrieffe, in her memoir, I was going to mention Captain John Montresor. His wife was American as well. And boy, do I have a video coming out for you about Captain John Montresor, another scandalous story. I think you'll really like that. So please subscribe so you won't miss some of these great Revolutionary War stories I have for you that aren't very well known. So Major Moncrieffe and General Putnam are very good friends over a long time period. And Miss Moncrieffe was born in Scotland. Her father married in Scotland when he was there. I think the family originally is from Scotland. And her mother, when she married Major Moncrieffe, who was then Captain Moncrieffe, was only 14 years old. By the time she was 20, she had given birth to Margaret and her brother and died. Major Moncrieffe then was sent to America. Margaret and her brother stayed for a time in Scotland, and he married an American woman. She happened to have been a Livingston. And some of you may know that the Livingstons were one of the most rebellious families in New York, very wealthy, very powerful, and very much in favor of the American Revolution. So he married a Livingston woman. Margaret and her brother then came to America to live with them. And she said that the Livingston woman was a very dour woman, very structured. She never smiled, but she had quite a dowry. She died. Her father inherited the money, and his current wife, when the story takes place, is indirectly related to the Jay family, another rebel family, right? John Jay, first Justice of the Supreme Court, later governor of New York, ambassador to Spain during the Revolutionary War, that Jay family. So Major Moncrieffe gets sent with the British somewhere out off of Staten Island, and he sends her to stay with her relatives in New Jersey. And she says she's very unhappy there because, of course, they're all patriots. They're all in favor of General Washington and the patriots. But she says, her heart is with her father and General Howe and the British side of things. So Miss Moncrieffe writes a letter to General Putnam, who she's known most of her life. And she says, I am very unhappy here with these Livingstons and Jays and everyone. As you know, my sympathies lie elsewhere. Would it be all right if I came to stay with you, Mrs. Putnam, and your daughters until my father returns? Now, today in 2024, we look at that and we say, why would an American commander in command of the forces in New York, who of course is going to have all kinds of conversations going on in his headquarters with his staff, where he lives with his family, about deployments and about strategies, why would he allow the daughter of an enemy commander to come and stay with him? Seems crazy to us, right? But we have to go back to the 18th century way of viewing things. General Putnam says it's honor. It's a system of honor to his friend, Major Moncrieffe, who he's known all of these years, and that he feels that it is incumbent upon him to take Moncrieffe's daughter into his home, where he knows she'll be well cared for, managed, and safe until his return. So he tells her, okay, you can come and stay with me. General Putnam sends one of his staff across the Hudson to New Jersey, picks up Miss Moncrieffe, and Miss Moncrieffe takes up residence in number 1 Broadway with the Putnam family, where she remarks that the house is very beautiful, that she enjoys spending a great deal of time up on the roof, looking around, enjoying the view. It's, late spring, so the weather is very nice. And she, all in all, is feeling very welcome there. She also notes, though, that Mrs. Putnam employs her daughters and Miss Moncrieffe almost constantly in spinning flax for the American soldiers, because she says indolence or laziness is not approved of among American women. So she's working away with this, and she's painting paintings and doing flower arrangements and things. And she gets invited to attend a dinner where General Washington and some other officers are present. And while they're there at the table, they offer her an opportunity to toast. And Miss Moncrieffe toasts General William Howe of the British military. Of course, some people around the table are really stunned and shocked by this. And General Washington is very, conciliatory, very kind to her. And he says that he'll accept the toast to General Howe if she will promise that when she goes back to her father and is offered the opportunity of a toast, that she will toast one of the officers here who have been so kind to her. And she agrees to do that. And that is all smoothed over and no problems. Well, Miss Moncrieffe is then moved from 1 Broadway right there at the base of the island, where you can see all of the British deployments. You can see what they're doing on Staten Island. You can see the Navy moving in. You can see everything. Suddenly, she's moved all the way to Upper Manhattan to General Mifflin's headquarters, which I think was the Jumel Mansion at that time. And she remarks that General Mifflin is very kind to her, and that his wife, a Quaker, is very beautiful and a very kind and gentle woman. And she stays there with the Mifflins for a time, and then it becomes time to return her to her father, who's returned to Staten Island. So off she goes. She has an escort across the harbor. Halfway across the harbor, she's escorted by Americans. They're met with a British barge. She transfers over to the British barge, and off to Staten Island she goes. No one on the American side thinks about Margaret Moncrieffe. Again, there's more important things to think about, right? The Revolutionary War happens. The Revolutionary War happens. The United States Constitution is ratified. George Washington is president. Israel Putnam's aide, Aaron Burr, is now a senator, and things have moved on. And then Margaret Moncrieff Coughlin's memoir is published. And she has a very different story about what occurred in the summer of 1776, very different than anything anyone has heard before. And this story is going to give rise to all kinds of stories about Senator Burr. And as you could imagine, his supporters are going to use it one way, and his detractors are going to use it another way. So we're going to look at what Mrs. Coughlin said happened that summer, and then take a look at what some of Burr's friends and biographers said happened that summer. So this is the scandalous story of now Margaret Moncrieffe Coughlin. So this is the cover page of Mrs. Coughlin's memoir, which is really an incredible memoir to read. I will put a link in the description of this video where you can download it and read it yourself, because it turns out that she's a very unusual woman for her time. So she writes about her time in New York. And of course, she talks about the things she said before, her family story. She was unhappy in New Jersey. She went to stay in Israel Putnam's home. And she says she fell in love with a young officer there who reciprocated her love. And she says when she told General Putnam that this young officer was also in love with her and she wanted to marry him, that he was outraged. And he said, why, of course, this is completely impossible and ridiculous, because you know this man you're in love with would draw his saber and ram it right through your father if they were to meet each other on the battlefield. In other circumstances, I might approve of this, but in this circumstance, this is impossible. And he sends her back to Staten Island. So she says this is the reason she was returned to Staten Island, because she had professed the mutual love of her and this young officer. Now, nowhere in the memoir does she give the name of this officer, but everybody knows later she's talking about Aaron Burr. She's talking about young Major Aaron Burr. And she says that she cried all the way back on the barge to Staten Island because she was leaving behind this young man who was fighting for liberty, fighting for freedom, and fighting for all of these great ideals. And she was being returned to the old ways of England, which she had found were no longer attractive to her. Well, she gets back to Staten Island with her father, and her father almost immediately marries her off to a Major Thomas Coughlin. Coughlin turns out to be an unbelievably abusive brute. And she says that on the way back to England in the ship, he beat her, and excuse me for being graphic, and raped her so often that the captain of the ship, who happened to be Captain Kidd, not the original Captain Kidd, he was dead already, another Captain Kidd, threatened, to lock him up for the whole rest of the journey if he didn't leave her alone. So this becomes her miserable life, married to this abusive man. She gets back to England, she runs away from him. Her father, now also in England, is so angry at her for running away, he cuts her off. She now has no income. So the only way for her to make a living is the way all beautiful women in England who had no wealth and no family to support them made a living, and that was to be a companion to wealthy and powerful men, which she does over the next 10 years. And she tells the story of her relationships with all of these, titled men in England. And by the time she's 30, she's been with many of these men. They use her and discard her. She has all of these debts. Sometimes they pay the debts, sometimes they don't. She winds up in debtor's prison. She has 5 different children by these men. 2 of them are living with their father. It is an unbelievable story. And she also talks about how terrible it is that this is the only way for a woman to survive. She also talks about the decadence of the aristocracy and how they believe everything is theirs to use as they please, including human beings. It's a really interesting book to read. And this is the passage that got everyone so wound up. Let me read it to you. This is what she wrote. Oh, may these pages one day meet the eye of him who subdued my virgin heart, whom the immutable, unerring laws of nature had pointed out for my husband, but whose sacred decree the barbarous customs of society fatally violated. To him I plighted my virgin vow, and I shall never cease to lament that obedience to a father left it incomplete. To whom did she pledge her virgin vow? Let's see what else she has to say about this officer. Okay, and she goes on to say this. Now, excuse the melodrama, but this is the way people wrote at the time. My conqueror was engaged in another cause. He was ambitious to obtain other laurels. He fought to liberate, not to enslave nations. He was a colonel in the American army and high in the estimation of his country. His victories were never accompanied with one gloomy, relenting thought. They shone as bright as the cause which achieved them. Wow, what a commentary. So, of course, as you can imagine, when this memoir hit New York, everyone started gossiping about what went on with 14-year-old Margaret Moncrieffe and then maybe 21-year-old Major Aaron Burr. Of course, she mistook and said he was a colonel, but he was a major. And tongues started wagging and rumors started flying. Now, Mr. Burr himself, if he did tell anyone about it, none of those documents exist. And if he did write anything about it, those journals no longer exist. So we can only depend on various observers of the time to tell us what they believed happened. And of course, as you know, witnesses all have different stories about it. Now, it seems Putnam said nothing about it. He didn't care. But Burr's biographer and good friend, Matthew Davis, in his Memoirs of Aaron Burr, tells a story that he believes this really happened. He says that Burr could not control himself around women. Davis says that it was Burr's biggest personality flaw, that in spite of his intellect, his courage on the battlefield, his ability as a commander and as a battle strategist, and also his great political capabilities, his one weakness in life was women. And he claims that Miss Moncrieffe, although she was 14 years old, was very much and very knowledgeably a woman at that age. So that's interesting. That's Matthew Davis' view of what happened. Burr's also later biographer, James Parton, he calls out Matthew Davis as being ridiculous. He says, if you read what she says that she gave her virgin vow, meaning nothing happened to them because she was taken away before they could be together. He also says that people later in Burr's political career, of course, used the Margaret Moncrieffe story to try to later claim that Burr throughout his entire life was bad. So he's saying that after Burr killed Hamilton and after Burr was accused of treason, of which, of course, he was found not guilty, that his detractors used the Margaret Moncrieffe story to say, see, Burr was bad from the time he was young. Keep in mind that was also done to Benedict Arnold. We tend to do that, right? When someone we think is bad, we look through their life and try to find everything that was bad to prove our negative view of them. So Parton says that that is likely what happened, that nothing happened between them. Parton also tells us that Burr was not in love with Miss Moncrieffe. He thought she was a spy. That Burr thought that in the painting she was painting, there were coded messages by colors and arrangements of things that she could then bring back with her to report on the deployments and strategies going on, that she was listening in and keeping notes, and that her flower arrangements also reflected some sort of code. She would arrange the flowers and then paint them, that Burr believed Miss Moncrieffe was a spy, and she was sent as a spy, and that the reason she was returned was not because she told Putnam she was in love with Burr and Putnam was outraged, but because Burr told Putnam he suspected her as a spy and that she should be returned to the British, and she was. Now, later, Miss Moncrieffe, when she was on Staten Island, was at a dinner, and she was offered a toast, and she toasted to General Putnam, who she said had been so kind and generous when she stayed with him. So that is our interesting story, right? Later biographers also reject the story that there was anything romantic between Burr and Moncrieffe. Now, in 1860, long after everyone in this story had, was dead and gone, Charles Burdett published this, the story of the first love of Aaron Burr, Margaret Moncrieffe, this wild romance novel, which supposedly contains the cipher used for them to communicate secretly between each other. So the story of Burr and Margaret Moncrieffe went on for, let's see, 1776, 1860, for 100 years, because Mrs. Coughlin wrote her memoir where she talked about her love for this American officer. I hope you enjoyed this video about the history of One Broadway. Thank you so much for your support. If you liked it, please like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to grow my audience here as I no longer do walking tours in New York City. I'm trying to reach as many people here now on YouTube as possible. So I very much do appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Mrs. Q.